Hello, and welcome to the first Financial Crime Forum focusing on Australia. I'm Nigel Morris-Cotterill. We've been the Financial Crime Forum since the late 1990s, and since moving online, we presented single-issue fora for a global audience. For 2024, we reverted to our face-to-face format of multiple issues concentrating on a single jurisdiction, but also for a global audience. Our speakers are senior figures in financial crime discipline, practitioners, and academics. Wherever the forum is focused, we start at 2 p.m. We have 3 presentations plus a discussion between the speakers where we put questions that you, the audience, have posted to the chat function on the bottom right of your screen. We aim to have you home in time for tea, or if you're watching from an office, in time for signing the mail, which of course hardly anyone does anymore. Please don't turn on your microphones, and if your connection is a bit flaky, turn off your own camera. It uses a lot of bandwidth. For reasons we don't know, Google is not allowing us to share screens, so there are no slides today. We are recording, but you will be invisible so long as your microphone is turned off. We have a record of paid delegates, but not a record of guests. Right, so that's the housekeeping. On to today's forum. Dr. Michael King, PhD, QUT, is a lecturer in fraud and financial crime at the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security at Charles Sturt University. Prior to joining CSU, he lectured at Griffith University's Academy of Financial Crime and developed the Commonwealth Bank of Australia micro-credential, the framework and regulatory environment. In addition, he created the 2 foundation subjects for the Graduate Diploma of Financial Investigations and won 2 teaching awards for this work. Dr. King is an associate at the University of Queensland Centre for Research Excellence on Achieving the Tobacco Endgame, where he is researching illicit tobacco. And today he will speak on Is Organised Crime Organised? The outlaw motorcycle clubs moving into illicit tobacco. Dr. Hannah Harris is a senior lecturer at Macquarie Law School and research fellow with the Financial Integrity Hub, where she is a transnational law and regulation scholar. Her research focuses on evaluating and enhancing regulatory solutions to overcome major transnational challenges, including corruption and financial crime, illegal locking, and deforestation, modern slavery, and human rights abuses. She is the chair of the subcommittee on corporate liability under an international anti-corruption court, and her recent article in the Transnational Criminal Law Review outlines the potential for corporate liability at the international level to more effectively combat economic, social, and environmental harms resulting from corrupt and unethical practices in transnational businesses. Today, Dr. Harris will speak on the Commonwealth Fraud and Corruption Control Framework, its application in Australia, and to overseas companies doing business with Australian companies. Mr. Luke Raven is a maven. I'm going to say that again. Mr. Luke Raven is a maven in the field of financial crime, risk and compliance. From his first job in an office in a dodgy part of town where staff didn't feel safe walking to the station at night, he developed a fascination first with credit card fraud and over time with the entire gamut of financial crime, from the perspective of the financial institution, from huge banks to tiny fintechs and everything in between. Mr. Raven's experience as a practitioner allows him to give insights that are absent from, for example, regulators and policymakers. Today he will ask, are human trafficking and wage theft points in the same scattergram? Actually, he said continuum, but I changed it. So to start, Dr. Michael King.
Well, thank you, Nigel, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present today at the Financial Crime Forum. My topic is organised crime organised, with a focus on looking at the outlaw motorcycle clubs moving to the illicit tobacco market, with particular reference to Victoria. So what does my research do? Well, much of the international research on tobacco falls into 2 camps. That which studies the smuggling side of illicit tobacco, particularly in jurisdictions of Europe. And then there's the health ramifications of smoking illicit tobacco. There is very little looking at the policing of the illicit trade, particularly domestic production, okay? So 15 years ago, an Australian researcher at a medical conference decried on the Gold Coast decried the small body of illicit tobacco research in Australia. 4 years prior to that, the great criminologist Gil Geis said the same. He really did wonder at how extensive was the spectre of organised crime or the fear of organised crime within the Australian sector, and he didn't have an answer to that. Okay. So tobacco products in Australia are legal. Okay, it's supply and consumption regulated, at times very strictly. It's so advertising, for instance, is limited. There's been a concentrated effort to ban the advertising at point of sale. Introduction of plain packaging is quite innovative in Australia, and each jurisdiction has laws on how to regulate smoking. So smoking within so many metres of doorways, smoking in public places, etc. And to a lesser extent, who can actually open up a cigarette shop and sell cigarette-related products. And that is regulated at a state level, okay? The issue of vaping and vapes and e-cigarettes is more problematic. And there's two jurisdictions in Australia that don't have robust, at the present, regulation of particularly vaping, and that is Victoria, which is now up to its second inquiry into this very issue, and Queensland. And Queensland are introducing a raft of regulatory measures which come into effect September this year. So bearing in mind it's a legal product, 1 in 10 Australians currently are daily smokers according to ABS data. Okay, so that's something that regulators have to understand and researchers have to accept. Okay. So what is illicit? Well, the product is illicit because of 3 reasons. If it's unbranded, so chop leaves, so that's an Australian term for that roll your own tobacco. Counterfeit products, so these are fake cigarettes. Yep. Counterfeits. So you don't know really what you're smoking. You might not know what you're smoking in a cigarette, but you really don't know what you're smoking with these. And then contraband. And that's an important category because they are purchased legally in one jurisdiction to be moved to another jurisdiction without the appropriate paperwork and paying the regular regulation, excise, tax, VAT, whatever you want to have it. And they typically come to the Australian market through the Middle East, particularly Dubai, and also throughout Asia. So Vietnam, Thailand, and then shipped through Singapore is typically how they come. Okay. So the illicit market undermines smoking control measures through health, as well as a revenue potential risk. Now, there is some research globally to suggest that it actually funds terrorism activity, but they're quite old studies, okay? Now, Australia has one of the highest cigarette prices per stick in the world, and it's increasing on a yearly basis by about 12.5%, okay? Now, the government would say that they're increasing taxes on cigarettes to help people quit, because it's a financial incentive to stop. And that's where the vapes and e-cigarettes kind of came in originally as an idea, that they would be a mechanism to get you off cigarettes, reduce your nicotine intake, and eventually you would smoke. Like other initiatives, it hasn't worked out how it's supposed to. And then there's a core group of people who have no intention of giving up cigarette smoking. And so they will make the choice to continue to smoke illicit products because they're cheaper. Kind of makes business sense, doesn't it? And that's the problem. It makes business sense. So in 2015, the Australian Crime Commission, surprise, surprise, found that organised crime was now entrenched within the market, which has a subsequent loss of revenue for the ATO. And then more recently in 2020, the Law Enforcement Committee in Parliament concluded that it's a key concern, the illicit tobacco trade. Now, how the Crime Commission has come up with the fact that organised crime is involved, from a research perspective, it's pretty sketchy. Yes, but they've got their own sources, I suppose. How much does this talk about? Okay, so if you take a step back, excise and GST on tobacco-related products, $14.3 billion last year to the Australian economy. Okay, the ATO in their reporting estimate that the shadow economy, so the cash economy that's out there in the Australian community, $12.4 billion. The ATO in their latest tax gap figures calculation for illicit tobacco, $2.3 billion in evaded excise GST. We're not talking small sums of money. KPMG estimate on behalf of the tobacco lobby that the tax gap is $3.4 billion. But there's lots of issues with how they report the figures, and there's a good indication to suggest that they deliberately overinflate the problem to get government to invest in resources to stop the illicit tobacco trade, obviously to encourage people to stay smoking. So as a researcher, these cases that I'm showing you now are typical of what you see in prosecution data, okay? When the cases eventually get to court, if someone's planting domestic tobacco, even at the 5 acres, which is a potential loss of revenue of $2 million, they're lucky to get 8 to 10 months, okay? Most of them are even suspended after 3 to 4, right? So we're not talking heavy-handed custodial sentences. It's a little different for the large-scale importation. And in this case, 16 million cigarettes in 2 shipping containers that never made it past the port because they were intercepted, nearly $18 million in revenue. And the offender got 3 years, 3 months, and then will be deported once the sentence is finished. And the domestic side, since 2017 to now, they've had 21 prosecution cases. Border Force no longer publish, and haven't for the last 5 years, published how many custodial sentences arise out of tobacco. Okay, they lump all their cases in up until last year into a prosecution outcome. Last year they didn't report anything. So in terms of, it's a blank category. So it is hard to find these figures as a researcher. As a researcher, I got used to seeing, these cases, and there'd be video of the AFP, a local police agency, Border Force, ATO, doing a raid on a property. Now they've gotten really smart. They use drones and motorbikes and give it to the media, and it's really informative. The public think that there's this massive bust, and people arrested, and then it peters out in the media. The more spectacular pictures are the open shipping containers with carton upon carton of tobacco, cigarettes. In the old days, they used to hide it behind furniture. Pizza boxes used to be a good one as well. Television parts, etc. Car parts. Now they can't even be bothered. They just whack the cigarettes from the one end of the shipping container to the front door, pack it with cigarettes. If it gets intercepted, it doesn't matter. It's the cost of doing business. This is a volume crime. And the police are very happy to open it up and get their photographs, because it's one metric, I suppose, is how police measure the success in intercepting these operations. And it also makes the public feel good, because it makes them feel that there's the law enforcement and government is doing something to protect them. So last year in March, this became a real concern, because there was a number of arson attempts and being successful on vaping shops and tobacconists in Melbourne. Starting in March, escalating through to October, November, and a few more tail end of January this year. And it started shining a light, as one of the newspaper articles, on this lucrative trade. The ABC used the term war, which was really unusual because the last time war had been brought into the illicit tobacco, not so much illicit tobacco, but certainly outlaw motorcycles, was the Great Nordic War, Bikers' War, which happened in the Scandinavian countries in the mid and early 1990s, where 105 people ended up being killed between the rival clubs, and they were using rocket-propelled grenades to fire at clubhouses. And that was before the Copenhagen Bikie War, which happened in the 80s. So, you know, that is strong language. And then the other language that I found quite interesting was, among those arrested was a member of the FinCrimeTV Outlaw Motorcycle Club. Indeed, one of the first stores to go up, a vape store, it was suggested that they had an association with the FinCrimeTV. Now, that's the first time in Australia's long illicit tobacco history that outlaw motorcycles have been identified. We've had the odd firebombing, we've had the odd ram raid in Queensland of tobacco stores, yet to be charged, ongoing investigations. No evidence suggests outlaw motorcycles clubs have been involved. So this is a very interesting point in time. So how big's the market? Well, obviously, most of the risk is identified by tobacco coming in at the border. And as you can see, the intercepts in 2019 are huge. Interestingly enough, the latest ABF report suggests that the rate has fallen to about 450 tonnes. And they're not sure why. I suspect it's probably because vaping products are being imported, and at times they can be legally imported, and then there's the legal issues with that, as well as the rise in domestic cultivation. Now, bearing in mind, around 7 to 8% of containers are scanned at the border, so there's a good chance that items will be missed. So we've got a tobacco task force. It was established in 2018. It's managed by the Border Force with ATO employees seconded, as well as AFP. And their idea is to disrupt organised crime. Okay, they're an extension of the 2016 project, which was a strike force. And because of the 2018 task force, they actually got some more powers. Okay, now you can be convicted up to 10 years. Prior to that, the maximum custodial sentence was a whopping 2 years. And that's because most of the excise deterrents were fines, okay? And we're not talking huge fines either, with the rate of the return on investment, so to speak, that you can get from this product. So organised crime, you know, government's been concerned about this for a number of years. So I just want to provide a brief overview of what that means. The UN defines organised crime as 3 or more persons operating together. There's a period of time in which they operate together. They're acting to commit a serious crime, as we define Australia. And there's obviously a financial benefit. Now, there's lots of problems with the definition of organised crime. Researchers struggle with it. Regulators struggle with it as well. But, you know, we can just work out that there is a degree of sophistication at times in their planning, and there's more than one person behind the scenes. So in Australia, the Institute of Criminology reckon organised crime is a $60 billion issue. And then there's various stats on how that's broken up. But there's lots of perspectives on defining organised crime. And some organised criminal groups are very structured, and highly organised. Others will come together and work as a one or two off operation. And that's the definition that really fits in with outlaw motorcycle groups. Okay, they're complicated to deal with. As a researcher, there's a solid body of research and emerging research in Australia on them, as well as a lot of research from Scandinavian countries on outlaw motorcycles, how they operate within the legitimate business spheres, how they operate with violence, etc. But as a brief highlight, they've been around for a long time. They really expanded after World War II. There's a strict hierarchy. There's degrees of evidence, as well as from law enforcement reports, that they're involved in criminal activities. There's a strong social element to these groups. They talk about the one percenters. They also have a tendency to use violence. So firebombing of clubhouses is not unusual, and it happened quite a lot during the 1980s, early 90s, even in Queensland, where the Hells Angels headquarters at Albion was firebombed a couple of times, and they sold the property. And there's also strong evidence that they penetrate into legitimate businesses, often pubs, clubs, tattoo parlors, to the point where some government agencies have tried to regulate that involvement. And so there's people like Mark Locks do a lot of research on these typical gangs. David Bright is also a researcher who's looked at this, and then there's the Institute of Criminology. Now, interestingly enough, none of those researchers have suggested in any academic papers that the outlaw motorcycle clubs until now have been having any interest in illicit tobacco. Nor is there any interest globally on them involved in tobacco trade as well. So that's a bit of an issue. So we've got a typical structure, and this is why they're different to street games. And there's also evidence to suggest that they're different at times from other organised groups, organised criminal activity. Most organised crooks don't want to advertise that they're a member of an organised crime family, but outlaw motorcycles wear their colours with pride. Okay, they've got a particular pecking order on how they operate, and people, friends of the clubs, hanger-ons, unpatched members, so you're prospect, and then you get full patched and brought into the club. And there's that whole social dynamic that's very important to these people. So as I said, it is the business provides the individual. So the club provides individuals an opportunity to undertake effective levels of organised criminal activity for long periods of time. So for instance, in the Great Nordic Biker War in the 1990s, they had unpatched members raiding reservist army-based armories and taking rocket-propelled grenades, which then other members would use to launch at members' clubhouses. So you can see how they're very sophisticated. It takes a bit of planning and I suppose commitment to go to that level of violence. So what do they do? Well, we all know, and it's been well documented, that amphetamines and cannabis has been a big deal as a big income source for outlaw motorcycle clubs in Australia. We also know that they do use violence and standover tactics, and they can control the drug processing from production to distribution quite effectively. So what do they, in terms of legitimate economy, now the research in Australia is scant on this topic. So research overseas suggests that they are, particularly in the Nordic countries, construction industry is quite a prevalent industry that they're involved in. Obviously, adult entertainment industry, security companies, hotels, tattoo parlors, etc. But also labour hire in general. In Sweden, a number of clubs are involved in labour hire to hospitality as well as construction, and they seem to manage their staff very well. Apparently, there's very little industrial disputes when these labour hire entities are involved. So briefly, okay, I'll briefly talk about the illicit drug trade in Australia. The market's around $10 billion, okay? So there's some prices. Cannabis is $26, the upper end of that per gram. And then MDMA, which is obviously another product that the bikies like to distribute, $25 to $35 a gram. So that's a figure to keep in mind. That's a market, and obviously that's what the bikies are involved in. But that takes a lot to make MDMA in terms of time, effort, and stuff like that. Getting trace chemicals, etc. Cannabis is a growing product as well. But the drug population in Australia, regular drug using population, is sizable. But when you think of 10% of Australians smoke, there's a business opportunity there. So what's happened in Melbourne? So starting in the newspaper press, 4 people were arrested from events happening in March. Then there's been a number of attacks. One vape store, as I said, was linked to the Finks. Then we find links of people being arrested by the Finks and Comancheros, and more recently. So I think there's up to about 30 odd arson attacks so far. No, 40 up to now. So this is a huge issue. And what we're finding is, at least on the face of it, if you look at it, take a step back and go, cigarette, the margin, the profit margin is huge. The risks are low. And there was a report that it's more profitable to sell in volume tobacco than heroin. Now, my study in 2019 looked at tobacco prices for Chop Chop, and it was $20 a bag. The current price, according to the newspaper reports for tobacco, is around $20. So cost of living pressures have been huge in Australia, but obviously the outlaw motorcycle and organised crime gangs are very conscious of that, so have kept their margins down. So it's one of the few things that has not increased over time. The tax rate has, but the actual production costs and distribution and selling of this illegal product has not. Indeed, it's probably gotten scales of economy. It means they can distribute more. Okay. So the margins are there for the organised criminal gangs, particularly motorcycles, to take advantage of. Because they've had a lot of experience infiltrating legitimate businesses, they can adapt, okay? They can engage labour hires to harvest the crops, to cut the crops for domestic production, and then they can distribute. And then they can also call on their overseas counterparts, potentially, and there hasn't been any evidence at this stage from law enforcement such as has happened, but they could use networks and chapters overseas to also facilitate deportation. And how do they do this? Well, everyone in the club is not necessarily involved, okay? There's research to suggest that an outlaw motorcycle gang can run from a bad apple. So there's, one bad apple operating in the club, and the rest of the members aren't involved in that particular club, or the club is all in, is the organised criminal organisation. I would probably suggest that, at least in Melbourne, it would appear that because the limited police information out there for arrests is an individual or an associate, and it's one or the other, in each of these arrests, I would suggest it's operating on a club within a club. So these are club members who are setting up stores. They might be using non-club members, unpatched members to manage those stores, to be an employer of those stores, etc. But not necessarily the whole club's being involved. If the whole club was involved, that would actually make law enforcement process a lot easier, because they would follow all the members of the group, subject to them surveillance, etc., gather the evidence, and they could wind up the whole club. At the moment, that doesn't appear to be the case, but that's only speculation from what, of course, we can gain from public information. So I dare say, bikers get attention, okay? Happened in Queensland under Campbell Newman, and they introduced a vast array of laws that ultimately didn't work. People get concerned about bikers. You know, they're loud, they're big people, you know, they're very distinctive, they're very noisy. So this could actually, from a research and a public policy procedure, be the best thing to happen to illicit tobacco, okay? Because now everyone's focused on doing something about it, potentially. So at the moment, Vic Police reckon about half the tobacco stores in Melbourne are involved in illicit tobacco. Okay, so that's a huge problem for both the legal sector as well as the police, just to enforce that. They've made a number of operations and seized a lot of tobacco products, but seizing products isn't going to help. You know, they can go into a store and clear out the contents under a warrant, and then the evidence is 2 to 3 hours later, that store is repacked and restocked. Okay. You know, this is a product that they can readily available from warehouses, etc. The margins, as I said, are huge. It becomes an issue. The tax revenue at stake is huge. The tax revenues that the tobacco industry bring in and the legal taxes that they bring in, GST and excise, are huge. Governments need that money. It then becomes a public health issue, because should police even be doing this? Is a thing. This is really a health issue. Should the health department be taking a more active involvement? You know, what kind of campaigns? The campaigns to regulate the vape industry in Australia have been woefully inadequate. Whereas at the moment, if I need to stop smoking and I want to go to vape, I've got to get a doctor's prescription and go to a chemist and buy my anti-smoking device. But I can go to Woolworths and buy a packet of cigarettes. It just doesn't make sense. So if you're limiting people's opportunity to take off the e-cigarette opportunities, you're creating this, you're actually fueling the illicit trade. So but that's another part of the moving puzzle that's not well researched. And in enforcement, should Victoria Police be putting so much work and effort into this issue, which strangely enough seems to be only happening in Victoria? You know, why, when we've got similar market conditions in Queensland, isn't happening there? You know, I know, or any other Australian state. So it is a very interesting perspective. So I don't have an answer yet. I've got some ideas, but it's going to be a very interesting year or so within this space, because the enforcement processes may not necessarily deliver the outcome that we want in terms of stopping illicit trade. We might be able to stop some of the bikies' involvement. I don't think so. They will move while there's opportunities to make money, and significant money in this sector, and there's a mismatch in laws and regulations within the state itself, within public policy, there will be that opportunity for the outlaw motorcycle clubs to take advantage of that profit. That revenue leakage will go to them. So this is an interesting space, and as I said, it may be the best thing this tobacco war has to actually helping resolve a number of these ongoing problematic issues. Thank you for your time.
Do you want to have a sip of your tea?
Indeed, thank you. Hi, everyone. Dr. Hannah Harris, a research fellow with the Financial Integrity Hub. And thanks to Nigel for inviting me and also for the introduction, and to Michael for that really fascinating presentation on organised crime and tobacco in Australia, which takes me back to my undergraduate first exposure to transnational crime as a thing, which was actually in the context of tobacco, because my one of my first teachers was interested in the transnational tobacco trade. So didn't expect that, but really interesting to hear that it's a kind of ongoing challenge domestically here in Australia as well as on the global scale. Before I begin, although I feel like I kind of had, I'd just like to briefly acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I currently find myself on today, which are the Darkinjung people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since time immemorial. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I am really, really delighted to be here, and I think this is such a wonderful kind of group to bring these really important issues together. Today, I'm talking about the Commonwealth Fraud and Corruption Control Framework. So this will come into effect on 1st of July this year, 2024. And the framework represents an important component of wider integrity reforms that, if you're following the news, you might have seen are continually unfolding in Australia and are a priority for the current government. Have the potential to improve governance outcomes across both public and private sectors in Australia. And I've been asked in particular to look at how these reforms will impact Australian businesses and their relationships with overseas customers and suppliers. And I think this is a really fascinating angle to take, because the operation of this particular framework has a really significant potential impact on Australian businesses, and it reflects the kind of complex operating environment that these businesses are increasingly facing, both domestically and transnationally. Regulatory frameworks are diverse and often overlapping, which can pose substantial challenges to businesses seeking to develop robust compliance policies and mitigate legal, reputational, operational, social, and environmental risks. And you might have noticed from Nigel's introduction of the breadth of topics that I cover in my regulatory scholarship that there is some significant overlap in the approach taken to addressing things as seemingly diverse as illegal logging and deforestation on the one hand, bribery and corruption on the other hand, fraud and human rights abuses on another. And interestingly today, I think in all of our presentations, we'll see kind of some alignment across some of these issues when we're having another talk shortly about human rights dimensions as well. So one of the takeaway messages today, if not the takeaway message today, for me, is that the Fraud and Corruption Control Framework, combined with these wider integrity reforms that I'll discuss shortly, continue to align the regulatory expectations for public and private entities in Australia around certain core values. And I'd just like to identify now what I see these core values as being. So the first one is substantive rather than cosmetic compliance. When we're looking at a particular entity or organization and exploring the regulatory frameworks and enforcement actions around those in Australia, this idea of substantive compliance comes up consistently. So it's not about box ticking. It's about trying to motivate a principles-based approach to compliance. And this kind of contrasts with the United States rules-based model of regulation. So whilst we see some kind of synergies between the Australian approach and global norms, there are certainly some distinctions comparatively to the way that compliance and regulation is addressed in other jurisdictions, including the US. The next component is targeted and proportionate compliance measures based on robust risk assessment. So the regulatory frameworks, including the new fraud and corruption framework, are really trying to encourage entities covered by this regulation to develop targeted and proportionate measures. So this is not about a one-size-fits-all model. This is not about making sure that if you're a cupcake store in Newtown, you are avoiding deforestation and illegal logging in the Pacific in your supply chain, right? It's about assessing the risks that are most extreme for your specific industry or approach and addressing those in an effective manner. So kind of the first step for that then becomes this kind of risk assessment process. What are the risks we're exposed to? Categorizing those in terms of high to low, and then intervening as appropriate. So this is flexible, and it's not only flexible for the particular business in a particular sector, but it's also flexible for that business over time and space, right? Business operations change and adapt. And we see that with the fraud and corruption framework as well. There is a requirement within that, which I'll come to shortly, to continue to reflect on and update where necessary the compliance frameworks that are in place, the procedures and policies that are part of this, because things might change in the way that that entity is operating, and that will have a fundamental impact on risk. So the next one is individual responsibility and oversight. This concept that the buck has to stop somewhere. And this is kind of a new one that we see evolving in the Australian regulatory landscape. And I think it's an important one to watch. This idea that we don't only need entity level responsibility for potential misconduct or abuse, but also that needs to be attached in some way to this understanding that at its core, any organization is an operation of multiple individuals, right? So we're really seeing an increased kind of pressure on organizations to identify an individual that does have some specific responsibility for overseeing the development of compliance frameworks, their functioning, and their adjustment and adaptation over time in response to feedback that that framework should also be taking in. And I guess this leads us to the last dimension, which is a kind of holistic approach. And this is where different elements of an organization's compliance framework are all aligned, encompassing prevention, detection, investigation, referral and reporting, and also periodic review of a particular system that's in place, right? And that holistic approach might also include, and I will show that it does in the fraud and corruption framework context, outsourcing to other institutions and entities that play a role in regulation as well. So the good news is that these values reflected by regulatory developments in the fraud and corruption space are aligned with cutting-edge research on optimal regulatory design. So I really feel like Australia is moving in a positive direction around these kind of values and the approach to regulation. So they're really evident in the fraud and corruption control framework, but they've also been implemented through the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, reforms to whistleblower protections, expansion of Australia's foreign bribery offence, including the corporate failure to prevent foreign bribery, which aligns with UK law that's been around for about a decade now, and the implementation of Tranche 2 reforms of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist finance law in Australia. That is an attempt to better align that framework with Financial Action Task Force recommendations and the approach of other jurisdictions such as the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. Shout out to Tranche 2 there, I see. Okay, so I better actually dive into what is the Commonwealth Fraud and Corruption Control Framework for those of us who have survived this long without knowing what I've actually been talking about and haven't just left the virtual room. So the Attorney General's Department provides a really nice summary of this. The framework forms part of the government's priority integrity reforms to improve the standards of integrity across the public sector and enhance trust in government. So that's the kind of first point to make, is that this framework is focused on public sector integrity and accountability. But that obviously has flow-on effects for the private sector as well, because we exist in a world where the public-private divide is borderline non-existent or certainly eroded to a significant degree. So the framework is focused on prevention, and it has been designed to support a modern and coherent system of accountability for protecting public resources from fraud and from corruption across the Commonwealth. So there are really three elements to this framework. The first is the Fraud and Corruption Rule. So this is contained in Section 7 of the Public Governance and Performance and Accountability Rule, which is a legislative instrument that gets its power from the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act of 2013. So we're just going to call this the PGPA Rule and the PGPA Act. The rule sets out minimum standards for accountable authorities of PGPA Act entities in relation to the management of risks and incidents of both fraud and corruption. So there is a current rule, the current fraud rule, which will apply until July 2024, but it is limited to fraud. So one of the really big changes under the new framework is expansion to cover not only fraud, but also corruption. The other two elements of the framework are the fraud and corruption policy and the fraud and corruption guidance. Now we have the policy, we don't yet have the guidance. The guidance is due this month, but we don't have access to that just yet. So the policy is binding for all non-corporate Commonwealth entities as established under the Act, and Commonwealth entities and Commonwealth companies are also encouraged to adopt this policy. So here we already see a kind of expansion of the scope of the framework to apply to private corporations as well as Commonwealth entities, both corporate and non-corporate. And I will go into a little explanation of what all of these strange terminologies are in just a sec. That third element of the guidance, which will be published as an updated version of the Resource Management Guide 201, is titled Preventing, Detecting and Dealing with Fraud and Corruption. And we do already have a fraud guidance, but we hope that when we receive that additional guidance, it will provide insight into kind of the government's expectations of how to interpret these rules and what really needs to happen in order to ensure compliance with them. We should expect that very soon. I was kind of hoping it would already be out, but it did save me a little bit of last minute work, so that was nice. Okay, so why are these new changes important? As I've already mentioned, the most significant change is the expansion from just fraud to fraud and corruption. And this is really a mechanism to help complement the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission and its prevention and investigation functions. So we see how this particular framework sits within a broader integrity system. This change is important because it aligns the framework with the functions of the NAC and ensures that Commonwealth entities will also be aligning their internal policies and procedures to help with efficient implementation of the NAC's powers to oversee and enforce anti-corruption violations in Commonwealth entities. So this really will help with the feasibility of these wider integrity reforms because entities will have in place reasonable measures to prevent, detect and respond to fraud and corruption. And those can then be drawn on by something like the NAC, as well as other investigation and enforcement authorities that we have in relation to these types of misconducts and crimes. So under the new rule, entities must conduct assessments of fraud and corruption risk regularly and in response to changes to the structure and function of the activities of that entity. So that's this kind of flexibility dimension that I was referring to as a kind of core value of the regulation. There is also a requirement to develop and implement control plans to deal with these risks and to update those plans in response to changes within structure, function, or activities. There are periodic review requirements, ensuring the existence of structures and processes that oversee and manage these risks. So really trying to integrate a kind of whole of life cycle approach to compliance frameworks. Ensuring the existence of officials responsible for managing these risks, and that's where this individual dimension comes in, right? So identifying and making clear and transparent who the buck stops with in relation to fraud and corruption risk. And keeping records, ensuring prevention mechanisms include awareness raising and training. So making sure that this is not just paper compliance, this ties into that substantive compliance concept, right? And also establishing and maintaining mechanisms for detection, investigation, and response, as well as recording and reporting suspected or actual instances. And this expands, again, the fraud and corruption framework outward to some of these other integrity innovations like the National Anti-Corruption Commission or potentially the Australian Federal Police, depending on the type of conduct we're dealing with and its severity. So this is where it's helpful, I think, to jump back to definitions really quickly. What is fraud and what is corruption? What are we trying to tackle here from the perspective of the new framework? So for the purposes of the framework, fraud is defined as dishonesty, obtaining or gaining a benefit or causing a loss or risk of loss by deception or other means. So this is the most generic, broadest definition of fraud that we have in Australia. It's set out in Chapter 7 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code, And it also extends to attempts to dishonestly obtain benefit or cause risk or loss to the Commonwealth. So the kind of constraining factor of the definition of fraud for the purposes of the framework is that it is fraud that relates to risk of loss or harm to the Commonwealth as a holistic entity. And then corruption is broadly defined in a way that is consistent with the NAC Act. So then we see this kind of alignment of these two dimensions of the integrity framework. It is any conduct that does or could compromise the integrity, accountability, or probity of public administration. So again, we're still very much situated in the public space here, but I think we're all aware of how kind of private activity can infringe on and negatively impact accountability and integrity in the public sector. I won't break down that definition in detail, but the NAC Act is a useful place to find that. And then finally, and I think very importantly for understanding the kind of scope of this framework for business enterprises, what is a Commonwealth entity? So the framework applies to both non-corporate and corporate Commonwealth entities. And as we saw with the policy, there is also kind of this encouragement that corporations incorporated under the Corps Act also apply the same policy, although it's not mandatory. So a non-corporate Commonwealth entity is legally and financially part of the Commonwealth. So this is departments of state, parliamentary departments, Australian Bureau of Statistics is an example, right? And any other entities that are prescribed under the Act. We also have, for example, Geoscience Australia, IP Australia, and Service Australia, right? So some general well-known examples of a non-corporate Commonwealth entity. A Commonwealth corporate entity is a body corporate, so it has that corporate structure, legally speaking, and a separate legal personality from the Commonwealth, but it is distinct from a Commonwealth company under the Corporations Act. So, for example, CSIRO, National Gallery of Australia, Reserve Bank of Australia, these are examples of Commonwealth corporate entities to which the framework applies. And again, distinction from a Commonwealth company, which is just any corporation established under the Corps Act. In some cases, a Commonwealth company may also be a government business enterprise. So for example, NBN. However, that is a kind of niche case where there are overlap between two categories. So in summary, the new Commonwealth Fraud and Corruption Framework requires Commonwealth entities, both corporate and non-corporate, to establish necessary measures and responsible persons to prevent, detect, combat, and report on both fraud and, novelly, corruption in all of their business activities. This is an expansion of the previous framework, which was limited to fraud, and it also expands certain requirements, particularly relating to the kind of iterative approach to processes and procedures and the allocation of responsible persons. As I mentioned, this ties into some other integrity frameworks, and in the interest of time, I don't want to delve into all of these in detail, but hopefully I will briefly be able to explore the failure to prevent foreign bribery offence in the context of discussing the interaction between the fraud and corruption framework and Australian business practices. So the failure to prevent offence is actually one I actively research myself, and I've recently concluded a project that evaluates the impact of this offence in the UK, where it has been operational for a decade. So we have a lot of kind of best practice and experience to learn on in the Australian context. So what does the Commonwealth Fraud and Corruption Framework mean for Australian businesses and their relationships with foreign counterparts? Australian businesses need to be aware that they're operating in an economic, social, and political climate where integrity is being prioritised. The Commonwealth Fraud and Corruption Framework means that businesses that interact with Commonwealth entities are likely to be subject to increased scrutiny and may be required to comply with more stringent processes designed by these entities to ensure that they, in turn, comply with the new framework. Businesses, therefore, should ensure that their own internal compliance policies and processes are aligned with the values underlying that fraud and corruption framework. Aligning their private sector fraud and corruption policies with these values presents a really beneficial opportunity for commercial enterprises to continue to engage productively with Commonwealth entities, and will also protect these businesses from the legal and reputational risk that might come from the increased scrutiny that these entities will be placing on business relationships. So there really is a bidirectionality here between the operation of traditional Australian business practice and the public sector accountability framework that is being developed. Conveniently, a stocktake of existing fraud and corruption controls within business operations will be timely for Australian companies to ensure compliance with some of these other obligations that I've mentioned, perhaps most impactfully, the new offence of a failure to prevent foreign bribery under the Commonwealth Criminal Code. So very briefly, as a result of this new offence, organisations can be held directly liable for foreign bribery activities by an associate, and this is very broad. It includes employees, contractors, agents, and subsidiaries. And the organisation will be liable regardless of whether there's proof they actively participated in the conduct. And the only defence available is if they can show they had adequate procedures in place to prevent it. So this new offence will attract penalties upwards of 31 million AUD and applies to organisations, as I mentioned, regardless of actual involvement in the conduct. This is a really good illustration of the evolving regulatory approach in Australia that prioritises establishment of robust procedures and practices that are actually effective. Right? So the approach aligns with global regulatory norms as well for responsible business conduct, which are increasingly putting the onus on businesses to explore their risks across a range of issues and develop compliance solutions to prevent, detect, deter, and report on that conduct. There is also potential that the liability under the failure to prevent model could extend to individuals, including senior management and board members, as a result of a construction of a breach of duty under the Corporations Act. And I think this is a really interesting dimension of the regulatory environment in Australia that we're going to see utilised more, also in the context of AML. So this really highlights the importance of reflecting on identifying responsible individuals within the business that have ultimate oversight of the development, implementation, and effectiveness of these policies and procedures, and processes to update who that person is, the extent of the accountability, how that relates to other dimensions of business practice, and how sufficient information is going to be provided to this individual or to a broader group to ensure that the policies and practices actually align with the business model. So at its core, integrity is about alignment of values and interests, so that incentives for compliance are strong and deterrents for misconduct are equally strong and impactful. Luckily for Australian companies, integrity regulation is not new in other jurisdictions, and we can look to the UK for some guidance on how to apply some of these frameworks. There really are opportunities to draw on global norms and experience to support the development of best practice, and we hope also that the guidance coming out this month will provide further insight too. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, Hannah. I have a stream of questions.
Uh-oh. Don't you have to save those, Nigel?
Sorry?
You have to save those to the end, right?
Don't go away, because I have pages. Well, not really. Actually, yes, I do. I'll make the print smaller so it's not lots of pages. Luke, welcome.
Yeah, I also, that was fantastic. I also have a lot to discuss on that. It was great. Look, I noticed there's been a few new joiners since we started, so I'll just reintroduce myself briefly. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's going to be a real challenge to follow the speakers we've already had talking so eloquently. It's going to be quite a different approach. You'll tell that I'm not academically inclined, and I'm going to talk about theories and theoretical big picture stuff, less hard figures than Dr. King, and no posh words like bidirectionality, which I'm going to have to look up after, but I'm going to probably try and work in to my own lexicon for going forward. So look, if you don't know me, my name's Luke Raven. It's really nice to meet all of you. I'm an Aussie fin crime professional with around 15 years experience, and I'm a bit of a LinkedIn influencer in the compliance and AML space. As ridiculous as that sounds, it's a thing. So I've worked for big and small banks and fintechs, and I have a lot of views on what it'll take to finally make a dent in serious and organized financial crime. One of those views I expressed a few weeks ago to Nigel. The beauty of LinkedIn is getting to meet people like Nigel. We were discussing a recent high-profile case in Australia against none other than our biggest bank for wage theft and how that interacts potentially, theoretically, with the AML regime. And he asked me to expand on this discussion that we were having and make it into a talk for this event. So I've done it against my better judgment, because there is no hard figures or anything like that. It's a bit theoretical and it's quite heavy and unsexy. But the view is this: modern slavery and wage theft are just different points on the same spectrum or scattergram. You can choose your metaphor. So now, before we get in too deep, I do want to say that I'm not minimizing wage theft or modern slavery through this comparison. They're both serious financial crimes. One is worse than the other, obviously, but two things can be true at once. And even though modern slavery is unspeakably worse, we're not awarding the gold medal in the Suffering Olympics here. So it kind of begs the question, of course, what are we doing? Why discuss this and compare them at all? The reason for comparing them isn't to minimize one or dramatize the other. They're genuinely linked in a few ways that I think are conceptually just really interesting, but also important to understand and have, hopefully, I think, some profound implications. Let Nigel know afterwards if you disagree and think I'm a terrible speaker. So the first similarity is that wage theft is, when you boil it down for the sake of simplicity, it's just modern slavery without as much abuse. You could look at it the other way as well if you want. You can flip it on its head, flip it around and say modern slavery is just wage theft with extra egregious, horrible offenses piled on top. It's just wage theft with extra steps. Now, I'd almost go as far as to say that you can't have modern slavery without committing wage theft. You can, but it wouldn't make sense for that to happen, because the whole point is to make money. And so you could almost say that that's true, so long as we're talking about things that happen onshore in Australia. Where things get messy and it's not quite so simple is when we look at supply chains and things that happen abroad. Of course, we all know that laws are artificial constructs, and what constitutes wage theft or modern slavery in country A may not do so in country B. And wage theft is distinctly something that you do to an employee or a contractor, rather than or as opposed to those people or outsourcing or someone in your supply chain. And that's basically all it is, wage theft. It's knowingly paying someone less than the law says you have to pay them, criminally doing so. Modern slavery is enslaving, creating new words here. Enslaving, it's enslaving someone. And there are actually more people living in conditions of slavery at this time than there have been in human history, which is a fairly appalling statistic. So modern slavery might mean paying them very little or nothing at all, promising to pay them and then not paying them. But that's not where it stops. It's a part of it, but it's not where it stops. And arguably, it's not nowhere, probably not even arguably, it's not the worst part of it. It includes serious infractions on their actual human rights, not just their financial and economic rights. So this might be beating them, murdering them, sexually assaulting them, restraining their movement, controlling their finances, taking their IDs, trafficking them, a whole heap of just extra awfulness. I told you it's a somber topic. Now, because it's so somber and so awful, a lot of countries have tried to impose their own definitions to businesses that operate there, including when those businesses have operations and supply chains outside of the country, which is where it gets a bit messy. So what I mean is, you can potentially breach a modern slavery law by treating workers terribly and paying them a pittance, even if you do it overseas, and even if the country you do it in doesn't really care or make that illegal per se. It's no surprise, given our position in the international community, that Australia is one such country that does have laws like this. Wage theft's different. You can't do it so much in your supply chain, and it does specifically mean paying someone less than the law dictates. It gets more colorful and complex, and my wife, who's in industrial relations and very good at this stuff, would probably have a whole separate thing to say on this, but essentially, if you abide by the law of the land, you can't be committing wage theft. Whereas that won't necessarily make a difference when it comes to modern slavery and the laws of that land and other lands. So wage theft, just to reiterate where we're at, you commit it in Australia. Modern slavery offences you can commit here, and we do have them here, and people like to close their eyes to that fact, which is very unfortunate, but we absolutely have it here. And it'll necessarily involve wage theft most of the time. But you can also have it happening abroad where wage theft isn't really a thing. But now that we know roughly what they are, and we can see how they can be similar, at least conceptually, the other major thing is this. They're both potentially relevant as financial crimes in their own right, or that are acquisitive and therefore beget money laundering. So as a brief sidebar, I'm assuming we mostly have Aussies in guests here today, but in case we have anyone from overseas or anyone needs to brush up on their Australian AML knowledge, Australian AML laws don't really make a huge distinction. The Crimes Act and the criminal statutes, they have separate offences for money laundering and proceeds and instruments of crime and fraud and modern slavery and all of these things. And we have separate legislation that deals with wage theft and criminalizes it. But when we talk about compliance, we're actually not talking about any of these acts. We're not talking about the Crimes Act. We're not talking about any of those. We're talking about the AML Act and the AML rules. These pieces of legislation, which I'll collectively call our AML regime, AML-CTF, let's not forget, but not that relevant for this discussion, that they don't differentiate when it comes to making banks and financial institutions monitor and report financial crimes and money laundering. We have to submit SMRs, which is suspicious matter reports, our version of the international SAR, for any reasonably suspicious conduct around a breach of an Australian state, territory, or federal law, and information that we have that might be relevant to prosecuting that breach. So it has to be criminal law. But we don't just have to be on the lookout for laundering that comes from acquisitive crimes, those being crimes by which perpetrators acquire a benefit, which include obscure benefits like greater profits and less costs. We also have to assess the risk we face of encountering other crimes and have systems in place to monitor for them. Wage theft and modern slavery both qualify. We know that our customers could be committing this crime, and we also know, crucially, that our customers could actually fall victim of this crime. Both sets of circumstances enliven our compliance radar and our SMR reporting obligations. And so we're obliged to make an effort to meet those obligations. And the thing is, it can be really hard. It can be really hard to actually detect wage theft or modern slavery with the more traditional transaction monitoring approach. So with a lot of the better performing transaction monitoring rules and scenarios, you're looking essentially for something that's there and it's unusual. It happened and it's unusual. A pattern of transactions that show that the customer is attempting to avoid reporting obligations, such as structuring cash deposits or withdrawing them, or transactions which coincide with known typologies, such as payments to certain jurisdictions for certain amounts, or a pattern of transactions that make it look like a customer could be smurfing or acting as a money mule for receiving funds. But I'm not going to reel off a half dozen generic rules for you more, that'll do the trick. But we complain a lot in the industry about these, right? About the high false positive ratio of many transaction monitoring scenarios that we have to go through. And the funny thing is we're actually a bit spoiled in those crimes, which all boil down to laundering money, because at least we have something positive that happened to look for. Many financial crimes that we are way worse at detecting, such as wage theft or modern slavery, they boil down much more towards missing from a customer profile, whether that's the payer or perpetrator or the recipient or victim. You can see this in some of the, I don't share this with any regulators, Nigel, but look, you can see this in some of the pretty hopelessly naive typology reports that we see produced from various FIUs and public-private partnerships over the years around the world. So desperate to put something resembling guidance together and to be seen to be doing something and to be seen to be helping their regulated financial institutions. And that's nice, I suppose. But for instance, look, a few real supposed red flags I've seen are things like only sporadic salary payments into an account and lack of rent coming out of an account. The thinking here is that these could be victims of modern slavery who don't have accommodation expenses or regular salary credits due to not getting paid and not living independent of their captors and controllers and masters, really. The problem, is, do you know how many banks I bank with? It sounds like a rhetorical question. I'm genuinely asking. I have no idea. I would guess it's like 7 to 17. I don't know. But the fact is, I'm not normal. I know I'm not normal. I happen to be the one person in Australia who gets real pleasure from undergoing KYC processes because of the field that I'm in. But even ordinary, everyday people often have more than one financial relationship. They may have more than one bank account. And there's really no way to know, as the provider of that bank account, what's happening in others or even if they have others. So a lot of these red flags fall down immediately. The same goes for businesses. And when I say businesses, I also include in that criminal businesses. And some of the red flags that are about those that are perpetrating modern slavery, it happens at an individual level and at a business level. They can be hopelessly naive as well. They're like, oh, they're paying far too little. It sounds simple and easy, right? And as we all know, for every complex problem, there's a solution that's simple and easy and wrong. So here's the reality. We don't know whether they pay their salaries from this account or another account or in cash or a combination of accounts. We don't know the underlying employment conditions of their staff, including, quite importantly, the number of hours that are actually worked and the type of work they're doing for those hours. So for instance, if you're a restaurant, you can't monitor a restaurant for modern slavery purposes the same for every employee, because you pay the head chef a lot differently to you pay the busboy, who also gets a lot different reimbursement than the gardener. And the law would have you pay each of them individually and differently, and you wouldn't necessarily know as the bank how to apply that lens. Very often, there'll be an intermediary involved, the fintech companies, the payroll companies. Paying them to pay others breaks line of sight. You could see 50,000 a month going out in salary and you could think, oh, geez, I'm great. This customer is fantastic. No need to worry, because it's going to a payroll provider. But you don't know. You don't know what happens once it's there. Is that 50 employees receiving $1,000, which is above the award rate for them? Is it 500 employees receiving $100 each because they're modern slaves? Is it $49,000 going to the owner's account at another bank? There's just no way to know. The bank would be none the wiser, and suggesting otherwise is a little bit naive. This argument isn't unique, right? It applies to things like environmental crime and tax evasion too. If you cut down a rainforest illegally and then profit from it, or you fail to dispose of toxic waste and therefore profit more as a result of not incurring that cost, or you just don't pay the tax man his dues, the same holes apply when it comes to transaction monitoring. That is, there's no positive thing to look for. There's no transactions to actually monitor, really. We're looking for an absence of things. We're looking for things which aren't there. And we only have one piece of the puzzle, and we don't know what might be on other pieces. And it's infinitely possible that what we can't see is actually on another puzzle piece. So is it any wonder that as financial institutions regulated for AML, we can't put the full picture together? This realization sometimes tends to culminate in there's sort of two ways you can go when you start having these conversations. You can express a lot of frustration and hopelessness, or you can look for innovation and be optimistic. So let's acknowledge the frustrated among us. That's me on a Monday before I've had my coffee. That they'll say this whole thing begs the question: why AML regulate everyone? Is financial intelligence actually the best tool in our toolbox? Why even do it? The thing is, it's our only tool, but it's not the only tool of the police. We're the financial sector where we can't really do a lot else. And if we can't find anything for quite fair and reasonable reasons, we can rest assured that we've done our part for having looked. But this gets harder, especially when you care deeply about the impact, though. And in my experience, great compliance people care not just about complying and checking the box, something that really resonated with me from the last speaker. It's actually about making a difference. But fear not, I'm nothing if not relentlessly positive, and I want to share that with you here today. So even on these somber topics, let's consider the optimistic view, because I think we have to, otherwise you just can't keep your head up. So the more optimistic outcome of this line of thinking is looking for innovation. It'd be really trite. There's a very easy out for me at this point, and I'm not going to take it. I just want to acknowledge, though, that I'm not going to take it. It'd be really trite for me to stand up here and start talking about the need for collaboration, to fill these gaps in our understanding and find what's missing better by putting puzzle pieces together. So look, I'm not going to. Fact is, I'm pretty convinced it's a bit of a myth, and it's not even a new one or a good one. I think someone or other has been claiming with breathless optimism that information sharing is the key to fighting financial crime ever since I was old enough to drink. And let me tell you, after this many years in compliance, I have drunk quite a lot. We're never going to have holistic pictures of everyone's economic profile through wholesale data sharing on transactions. So we should stop fantasizing about it, because it's just not going to work to plug all gaps in our knowledge. And the privacy trade-off is quite simply unacceptable. Not to me, and not necessarily to you, but to politicians and voters and banks and the end users of these their customers, right? Most people would not accept this tip of the scales in terms of privacy. And although I'm no privacy pro or privacy bro, even I could acknowledge that the bit of juice we would manage to get out of this, it wouldn't justify the squeeze. We still wouldn't be able to effectively fight wage theft, even, let alone modern slavery, with transaction monitoring across gigantic data sets, because we're just looking at transactions. We don't know what we don't know, and transactions bereft of context only tell us very little. So what I prefer, I'm supposed to be being optimistic here, right? What I prefer is to look at what actually has been done effectively to combat this. What lessons can we learn from people who are making a difference? How do we disrupt modern slavery and wage theft? A decent starting point seems like looking at what's actually worked. And unfortunately, more compliance measures do not seem to do the trick. It's been years since Australian companies of a certain size have needed, or in a certain state, have needed to employ additional compliance resources and measures. They've had to have modern slavery policies that have been captured by legislation. They've had to have procedures. They've had to make disclosures, reports. There's advocates appointed in governments looking at this. And there's very little evidence that it's done anything at the end of the day. Actually, look, that's not true. Being cynical, it's definitely fattened the wallets of a select few consulting firms who ironically treat their staff absolutely horrible, but I digress. I don't think we've made a huge impact through compliance-driven measures. So what we really need to look through is risk managers, people who are actually making a difference for the sake of making a difference, not because someone told them they have to look. One interesting thing is public awareness campaigns. They've proven somewhat effective. Like, no one's got a silver bullet, but especially for modern slavery and having, Sue and Greg recognize the telltale signs of abuse, so that when, the company modern slavery, so that when a young immigrant worker is brought into their household by a laborer to build a retaining wall, and the laborer is shouting at him and threatening him, and he's cowering there, you can tell, and you can, Sue and Greg are likely to say something. There was a prosecution of someone that lives in my suburb. It happens, and the big problem was that none of the other parents at the school events and things felt comfortable to go forward and say, oh, geez, how do they afford a full-time live-in nanny who they were treating absolutely awfully on their salary? They couldn't. They had a slave. It's actually not that difficult to put that picture together. And there's also some great stories about like air stewards and stewardesses recognizing people in distress, people in the process of being trafficked, and even purpose-driven NGOs working with police. They've done incredible campaigns. They've concealed education messages in TV movies being broadcast along highly prolific trafficking routes where human traffickers would bring slaves willingly without realizing the slaves would not realize that they were on their way to a life of horrid captivity and exploitation. And the slavers wouldn't look at the TV. They were bored, right? They were just doing their job. But the victims would, and they would recognize that, and they would self-identify, what's happening to this character right here is happening to me right now. This mirrors my story. And it was hugely successful. It was getting victims to self-identify and to opt out before they'd crucially crossed a country border and couldn't ask for help any longer. You had people freaking out and going and talking to the bus driver. And this is fantastic. It's actually risk management, not compliance. So this all works at a bank level too, theoretically. Okay, if you have branch staff interacting with people being abused or controlled or having their bank cards and ID documents held by someone else, these are great red flags and we can report them. But it's not as though we're in a unique position to do so and we can do so better than the public. In fact, it's only as useful coming from us as it is a grocer or a parent at school, but it's probably less useful because we get very concerned around things like tipping off, and even if it elicits an SMR rather than a call to police, the time span is too long. It needs to be, there's significant delays, there's possibilities of it not even getting seen. It needs to, even if it does make it where it needs to make it, it needs to be disseminated first through various levels of the bank and then by the FIU out to the authorities. We could just call the cops, you know? The other thing, of course, is that this all applies to modern slavery, but less to wage theft. So, you know, your wage theft victims aren't necessarily abused, and there's not as many telltale signs. That it's more financial. So what are we to do? The answer, I think, isn't in trying to do our financial intelligence a lot better with who we currently capture, but rather extending the capture to those with better and more holistic financial intelligence. So with probably no surprise to anyone that follows me, I'm going to give a shout out to our need to implement Tranche 2. So I'm talking, of course, about the AML regulation of so-called designated non-financial businesses and professionals. Accountants in particular, I think, have a huge part to play here and a huge chance to disrupt these types of activity if and when they get up to speed and start doing it. They're much more likely, I think, to know, like for like, what's usual for a particular industry player, and the data they will have is much more granular and line for line, because unlike a bank, the accountant sees the full book. Modern slavery and wage theft both result in unbalanced books, and well-trained accountants are going to be much more attuned to having their suspicions spider sense tingle when they note, that's a professional term, right? So when they note that a business is ludicrously profitable because of markedly low wage rates and labor expenditure. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a total abrogation of our responsibility in banks and financial services, but it's a great place to start piecing things together from a financial intelligence side and tackling both wage theft and modern slavery, because they really are points on the same scattergram. So I've spoken a fair bit. I'm sure I'm at least approaching time. I'll wrap up here and throw back to Nigel and hopefully some good discussion.
I was typing notes. I will read the one I was just doing. Accountants and lawyers, it's a blight on Australia that Tranche 2 has not yet come into force. The thing is that those that oppose it don't realise that it's actually in their best interest, because if they do in fact launder money, then under the Act, they are liable as principals. So for them to say, we don't want to know our customers, we don't want to look at transactions, we don't want to understand our customers' business or clients' business, is facile and moronic to the greatest extent. The problem is the police don't prosecute them. If the police prosecuted lawyers and accountants for failing to make, for actually laundering, and if you take fees, knowing, suspecting where they come from, you can't launder. Yep. The old idea that provided you gave value has gone. So now, if they're taking the money and they know or suspect or should have known or suspected, then they should be prosecuted. And it's only going to take 3 or 4 prosecutions for lawyers to start saying, hang on a minute, yeah, bring us, even if you don't pass Tranche 2, we're going to do it anyway.
That's true.
And that's what's needed. And I can't understand why Australia's law societies have colluded with America's law societies, or whatever they call them, to say lawyers aren't needed to do that. It doesn't happen. And they're talking about whether there is a breach of confidentiality. But the fact is, there is a professional rule that says if you if the client is trying to get you involved in a crime, then privilege goes out of the window. Well, isn't that exactly what's happening? Help me set up this company so I can launder tax funds. Help me set up this second company that I can put low wages through and pretend it's that I'm employing them in a laundry instead of in a restaurant. These very things are exactly where we have the problem. Yes, Hannah?
I was just going to flag, I think you've raised a really important point generally about something around individual accountability that I mentioned in my work as well. And it's something that we should be both optimistic about, but also cautious of, which is this idea of plausible deniability, which comes up a lot as well. And the way that we structure our regulatory frameworks is really impactful for whether we do incentivize transparency or whether we incentivize box ticking compliance and a step away from the actual accountability and the guilt that's involved. And I think we definitely see that in professional services really strongly. And Australia has a really interesting history of regulation of professional services that I won't get into, but it's a kind of fascinating experience around this issue. And designing the regulation effectively is one component. And as you point out, Nigel, another component is the enforcement dimension. But the better the design of the framework, the more effective targeted enforcement can be. And I think there's a little disconnect there at the moment that's contributing to this absence of enforcement and this desire to rely on the theoretical stick rather than the actual stick.
Well, I think part of that is that one of the things you drew attention to is the difference between the Australian approach and the US approach, where the US approach is much more codified, and frankly, so is that in the UK. If you look at the Financial Conduct Authority's rules and those of the Law Society, they are highly codified. This, I don't understand why well, no, I do actually. The UK has ended up doing it because the UK has spent 25, 30 years being influenced, let's put it politely, by the EU, where codification is the norm. The US has been looking at codification since, well, for 200 years, really. Whereas you in Australia have still managed to maintain the integrity of the common law approach. Now, I'm a common lawyer, commonish, and so I think the common law is exactly where we should be looking, because that allows the authority to land with the courts, and it has two major advantages. It's flexible and it's fast. Whereas one of the issues that we see with codification is that we've seen this in relation to fintech regulation, for example, is that the idea is that the regulators say, we don't currently have a regulation for this. Whereas if you say all businesses providing these services are regulated as banks, then you don't have to have detailed regulations for fintechs. They're taking in deposits, they're holding them, they're paying them out. That's banking. So stop messing around, ignore what it says over the shop front. They are providing banking services, regulate them as banks. But that's not the way that that those people who are fascinated by codification go. So I was particularly happy to see that in this particular way we're looking at that. Luke, if we can, something on that ish. The way that Hannah was saying about the responsibilities of individual officers, that there must be effectively a money laundering reporting officer for bribery and corruption and the like, and for fraud. I'm looking at this and thinking, does this mean that an organization should have one person to act as a lightning rod for all of this, be it money laundering, terrorist financing, for fraud, bribery and corruption, all of those offences, that one person should be the one that is the point of contact for all different, let's call them loosely, regulators? And if so, is anyone stupid enough to take that job on?
I was going to say, you need individual accountability doesn't mean one individual. It means everyone individually accountable for what is the proportion.
If you're talking about Commonwealth Bank, then yes, you've got 300 people in compliance, and they can spread the load. But if you're talking
that's more than that, mate, at Combank.
But if you're talking about a business with 25 people total,
yeah, that's true.
So, but the responsibility levels and the jobs are exactly the same, no matter whether you're a giant bank or a 25-person, well, whatever.
Can I tell you where I think we need to apply this stick a little better? Is from a lot of experience dealing with salespeople and RMs at various banks and fintechs. They don't care. They're not scared of anything, because they know that the worst thing that can happen to them is you throw out their money laundering client and they don't meet their quarter-end targets. That is the worst possible repercussion. The CEO can go to jail. The CEO can be fired. They can pay $1 billion, $2 billion, $4 billion, take your pick. Senior compliance staff can become the shame of the industry, and the bankers and RMs will quite happily have their very nice lunches at the posh, at Nobu or wherever else, because they made their quarter targets. If you don't incentivize both sides, if you just sort of, I hate the word because it's not accurate, but if you what's the word that they've co-opted where they say that they basically make you a sheriff? What's that word, Nigel? I'm blanking on it. Thank you. If you deputize, and it's the wrong word because we don't get guns and badges, but if you deputize only some of the people in the bank, you're not creating a bank that's hostile to financial crime. You're creating some people in the bank that are hostile to financial crime and other people that don't give a damn. That's my controversial take.
Can I build on that a tiny bit? Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because, and it's not a point that hasn't been addressed by Australian regulatory frameworks. Again, if we think back to beer, I know it was a while ago now, guys, and we tend to forget about royal commissions and things as we move forward in the world. But this idea that to have robust compliance and robust risk assessment, you need to take account of all business lines, right? All parts of the entity. And when you leave sales out of the equation, you fundamentally are not ensuring for, if we're talking about the bribery context, that's not adequate procedures. Adequate procedures do not end in the compliance room. So I think that's one dimension. And then if you're talking about modern slavery, or if you're talking about trying to prevent illegal logging or deforestation, those types of compliance frameworks as well, they need to go beyond just backroom compliance, even if we are thinking about it from a broader perspective.
One of the things on exactly that point is that the USA, a recent decision, I can't remember the name of it, an overseas company had a US office, and it had policies and procedures which were decent policies and procedures, but two senior managers in the US deliberately bypassed those policies and procedures. And the court said, yes, you had policies and procedures. Yes, these two bypass them on purpose, but the fact is the company's liable. And I think that's quite hideous. Michael, we have been talking about how conduct feeds into money laundering suspicion and and ultimately the reporting of it. Is there is it viable to say that the extent of criminal activity amongst motorcycle gangs is such that we should presume that motorcyclists or motorcyclists that are part of a gang are criminal, and therefore should we allow them even to have bank accounts?
Ooh. Look, in Australia, the research on criminality is divided. Mark Locks and Goldsworthy have done studies focusing on Queensland a few years ago now, and they didn't find criminality and even convictions within the motorcycle clubs that they studied as significant. Now, the Institute of Criminology has just published a series of papers starting this year, and they suggest otherwise. So I don't think at this stage we've got enough information for a bet either way. I would assume that if you were going to put your hand up and join the Finks, you're not doing it because it's for a Sunday bike drive. You know what I mean? Like the induction process into that particular club is a lengthy process. So, you know, you're not going there to be working at Bunnings. You're not going to go there for a job, you know, that's going to help you. You're going there for a particular lifestyle, I think. So taking away a bank account, but
John Walker has something he wants to bring up. But can I just do two things before we go to John? The motorcycle gangs operate locally, but they cooperate internationally. There's weapons, there's drugs, and all the other things. One of my colleagues is an insurance company some years ago, Swedish insurance company. He was a Swede on secondment to the UK, and he left his brand new Harley Davidson he was not a member of a gang, he just had a Harley Davidson. So John, your point about whether you should tag them all, probably not. He left it parked in the garage and came over to the UK to work. And he got a phone call one night saying, your garage has just been blown up. And a motorcycle gang had identified where his motorcycle was being kept. They'd used a rocket launcher to blow open the doors and nicked his bike. This is the scale of motorcycle gangs in other countries. In Australia, they don't seem to be quite as violent as that.
no, we haven't had the isolated problems where they had the Great Bikey War, where they actually were using rocket launchers at each other and blowing up clubhouses, and 107 people died a number of years ago. And that was ultimately a lot of law enforcement obviously worked to get that, but it was also the clubs coming together to work out a peace treaty. So I'm not underpinning the violence. Mark Lox's research is suggesting that it goes back to a kind of Celtic masculine culture, and that's what attracts certain people to these clubs. In terms of the criminality, he's less sure about that at this stage.
One of the things that came about from the wage theft issue was it became famous towards the end of one of Australia's big cooking competition programs, when it was discovered that a number of celebrity chefs had systemically underpaid their staff. Was this all to do with the new Sunday rules, or was it just that they never paid people properly anyway?
Oh God! Don't talk to me about George Colin Barris. I hate that guy for that. Yeah, I'm
only him though.
Tell, but I'm a husky guy. I eat out a lot, and I boycotted his restaurants as a result, which is about the worst outcome that happened to him. All he had to do was pay back the interest-free loan that his very poorly paid workers had given him of about $7 million, if I recall correctly. It was atrocious. Yeah, sorry, I don't know which one. I'll fight him. I'm not a fan of George Colin Barris, and I think that,
no, but the thing was that it wasn't only him. That was what he was the headline case, but it was discovered that there were a number of other famous restaurants.
Oh yeah,
that were not paying people as they should have done, which is really not very good.
I guess I should be thanking him, because I think he was largely the lightning rod, though, Nigel, which made it. No, this is ridiculous. This man hasn't suffered any ill consequences beyond Luke's one-man boycott, and that's what I think largely prompted criminalization now, which is a change we had to have.
That was ultimately my point. Is that what led to the wage theft? Michael, you mentioned Marlboro. You were saying that they were quite cheap. Incidentally, you said 25 cigarettes in a packet. Is that right?
That's how the industry measures a typical packet of tobacco. So that's how much you can bring into the country duty free, one packet. Although, look, you go to Woolies, behind the counter, most of them are.
That's not the point. The point is that you talked about Marlboro, and there's an interesting story about Marlboro cigarettes, which is that in the 1990s. In fact, earlier in the 1990s, before people started talking about money laundering, organized crime gangs were using containers full of Marlboro cigarettes and shipping them around the world, because they were one of a very small number of things that had effectively a fixed price from country to country if you take the duty out. And so They were also the second most recognizable brand on the planet at the time. The main one being Coca-Cola. And we're now seeing that developing, or say now, we've been seeing it for years, that developing with free ports, where those tokens arrive in a free port and they just stay there. There's no reason to move them because they can be allocated, reallocated within the free port, rather like the stones are allocated and reallocated on the island of Yap. Marlborough have been at the forefront of use by criminal gangs, not because they are such a ubiquitous product. Once gangs realized that tobacco could go off, they moved on to onto cassette tapes, not cassette tapes, VHS tapes, and then from that they moved onto gold and then onto computer chips, and that was how we ended up with the carousel frauds developed as part of that same process. So while you're saying that Marlboro is a cheap cigarette, they're actually incredibly important in our world because they've led to so much. So that's quite good.
They're also I suppose they're the benchmark cigarette that the tobacco industry uses to work out how much illicit tobacco is out there. So it's the product that when KPMG do their biannual survey of illicit tobacco, that's the product that they use. So they actually measure the Marlboro packets.
Oh, right. Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, Hannah's said that unexplained wealth is complex for the same due process reasons as criminalizing participation in gangs. As a Kiwi, we try to criminalize gangs. Turns out crime finds a way regardless of the patch. Well, that's absolutely true, isn't it? No matter what, normally it just end up in government. And that's not as facetious as it sounds.
No, it's not. But
exactly.
I think the broader point being that if you don't tackle the kind of underlying drivers of this criminality, which particularly with trafficking offences, but in any form of transnational crime, it's about profit. And it's about opportunity. And I think when you target the kind of the most visually obvious signals, you're sometimes catching the least involved or the least culpable actors in that particular group, which would be my concern for those mechanisms. That said, there are some, I mean, like Papua New Guinea was really struggling at the moment with illegal logging, has been for decades. They're looking at unexplained wealth provisions for the same reason, because you get a little bit desperate after a while, right? And there are ways to structure those provisions, I think, that have potential. But on the whole, I think we have to be careful about what we're willing to do to get at what we're trying to get at, and be very clear about what the actual harm is and who the actual culpable party is in that harm.
But with illegal logging, big problem in Malaysia. One of the things we know is that the money that's paid for the illegal logs is not paid within the jurisdiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there is no local financial trail to follow, which is obviously problematic. Michael, how much of a vertical market are these motorcycle gangs creating? Are they going from planting tobacco plants all the way up to production?
In terms of tobacco planting, there's no evidence that they've been involved. That's the thing. The 25 cases that the ATA has prosecuted over the last 2 years, most of them have been itinerant workers who have come out here to work, strangely enough, 4 of them that I readily recall, to work on plantations, doing harvesting whatever crops. COVID came. They shut those markets down. So they answered WhatsApp ads to look after some tobacco. So you had some guys from Lebanon who came out. You had some people from the Pacific Islands who came out to work. They're working on a farm, doing farm work. They knew it was tobacco. They had no problem with it. When they get caught by the authorities, they said, well, we didn't know it was that illegal. You know what I mean? So, and a few of them spent time in custody at a detention centre, learnt English, had a lovely experience, and then got sent back home. And that's the sad nature of this case. You know, the players who they're arresting and prosecuting are virtual nobodies. You know, they've got most of them have no prior convictions, but the domestic side, particularly, a lot of them have health issues. A lot of them are, 60 odd plus years old. So again, like I said at the start, these aren't what the normal public would regard as hardened, organized criminals. You know, at the very best, you know, they're a strange uncle or whatever. You know, that's the bizarre nature of this industry. The more organized criminal activity that happens in terms of the importation of containers of tobacco, for the most part, again, looking at the prosecutions, particularly in New South Wales, are people from the Middle East who have come out here. Most of them are long-term residents or now citizens. One of the guys, he's been involved in tobacco for 20 years. He's been part of an inquiry in New South Wales to the point where he was actually paying corrupt coppers, and they had I think ICAC looked at it, and they were stealing on search warrants tobacco. He was buying it off them and then reselling it. Now, he has done over 20 years of illicit tobacco. He's done 4 years in total in jail. So they're known players, but this guy is involved in outlaw motorcycles.
If you look at the tax aspect of this, you said that somebody got 4 years for $500,000 in tax evasion on tobacco, but people don't get 4 years for ordinary tax evasion. I mean, there were not very many people in Wickenby that got 4 years.
No, Wickenby had, well, okay, dare I talk about this? Wickenby was successful in terms of raising assessments and collecting money. The custodial sentences that they gave out were probably secondary. Right. There was more custodial sentences given.
You were using the measure of 4 years for $500,000 as indicating that the courts are going soft. But it appears to be that if we look purely at the tax aspect of that, the courts are actually quite harsh. So they're not just looking at the tax; they're looking at where the tax came from. It seems to me, or are they saying that income tax fraud is less serious than duty fraud, which, frankly, is what most countries have done over history. They've taken the view that duty fraud is the most serious thing you can do against the state department treason.
Correct. And that goes back, particularly from Australia's perspective. You look at the UK, where it used to be, you know, the cutlasses from the customs people compared to the tea and bickies from, you know, the revenue authority. So, yeah, that's a fair call. There are harsher penalties for the excise offences, and that's historically because until 2000, the excise department that looks after these was part of customs. In 2000, when GST came on board, they moved those functions to the ATO. So they moved tobacco, the alcohol and fuel to the ATO. The ATO typically, prior to that, well, they didn't have a surveillance capability. When they moved the customs legislation across, Commissioner Carmody at the time actually had to issue a directive. So, and I was in the area, we couldn't do it. We couldn't do car chases, and we could not carry firearms. Whereas in Border Force, in Customs, they did. So, and they also conduct surveillance, and that was new. But the ATO hoped everything would go away in 2006 when the last tobacco licenses were cancelled. So they thought this would be mostly a Border Force problem going forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
John Walker has said that he spoke to Michael Outram 20 odd years ago, and the view was taken that organised crime is business. I think that's right, isn't it? I mean, everything that you've been talking about, Michael, is these people are doing business. It just happens to be a criminal enterprise. So all of the money, Luke, from that criminal enterprise ends up in the hands of your employers, whichever it is at the time.
Depends on the
Luke has had more jobs in the last 3 years than I can count, honestly. migrates from high risk business to high risk business. At the moment, taking a break.
Organized crime is the ultimate expression of capitalism.
It is, to a great extent, isn't it?
Just to flag on the tax point, though, that's probably one of the primary distinguishing features between traditional enterprise and criminal enterprise, is the government is losing tax revenue on one and not the other. So I think that the point you make, Nigel, about the tax dimension of all of these different forms of misconduct and risk and harm, it is really powerful moving forward, and it's one that I'm pursuing in the context of, again, deforestation and illegal logging in the Pacific. But I think it applies because it has this transnational impact as well, and we have frameworks in place to repatriate lost tax revenues and to cooperate with foreign jurisdictions around tax. So that is a unique avenue, and I think one that we're seeing increasingly being pursued by regulators who are struggling to address criminality through other more traditional criminal law means.
Are we seeing more traceability of wood as it arrives? I mean, I know that there's been a recent case about the this is ridiculous, the origins of the stuff in particle board, and that was traced back to illegal logging. So somebody was able to track bits of wood covered in glue back to source. How common is that?
It's getting more common, but it's not super common. But there's been a huge amount of resources, particularly by the US, invested in DNA tracing and traceability and tracking systems exactly for that purpose. And it's come about largely because the initial effort was like, well, we need to get China on board because China is where the processing is occurring. So we can now track raw logs leaving source countries, but we just track them all to China. And then it gets processed and shipped out. And we now have this really robust framework of importation legislation that prohibits importation of illegally harvested timber. But how are the companies importing supposed to evaluate whether or not that product contains illegally produced wood? And so this traceability component is really important.
That's exactly what Peter Sue was talking about in the USA forum a couple of weeks ago, when he said that we know that a cannabis business is not supposed to sell to minors, but how do we know that cannabis business is or is not selling to minors? And here we have a problem. You can't monitor every single activity within a customer. That's just silly. And so we have the same problem here. Are we going to test part of every shipment that comes into a country to see if there's the wrong DNA in a piece of furniture? Half the stuff that's in it is in furniture that's covered in leather. So how are you going to get to it?
And again, this is where the risk assessment dimension comes in, and again, where potentially tax law comes in, because you can now highlight not testing every piece of furniture that's coming in, but testing pieces of furniture that are coming in on ships that have been related to companies that we know are consistently avoiding tax law in a domestic jurisdiction that is a source country. And so it kind of allows you to integrate those different frameworks.
I'm going to wrap up with the wise words of John Walker. He says, we should be logging the activities of organized crime, not trees.
Agreed.
Well, Hannah,
the best I could think of.
It has been an absolute delight. Anything we didn't do? I think we're finished, but anything we didn't do, anything anyone wants us to say as the last thing?
Thank you, Nigel. No, it's been a pleasure.
I've got one question. I've got one question, if I could, before we wrap up. Sorry, just Hannah. Just those. Do you have any insight? You mentioned the guidance. I only caught that when I joined. Do you have any insight whether that guidance will be? It seems to be coincidental with the adequate procedures guidance to be issued by the AG. Will they speak to each other?
I would hope so, honestly, Nigel, and I wish I could give you a fly on the wall answer to that. But I would say that this particular government and their approach to these reforms has been more coordinated than we've seen in the past. So I would definitely hope so, and I think that's also part of the reason why we maybe see a little hold up. So fingers crossed on that. And just also to Nigel's earlier point around kind of the role of the courts in all of this, and this idea of kind of principles-based law being still very core to the Australian model. I think it would be nice if we did see that kind of knitting together of a guidance with how can we develop kind of streamlined best practice, not only for dealing with government entities under the fraud and corruption framework, but also dealing with what is adequate procedures under the new failure to prevent bribery regime as well. So I think there is a huge amount of potential for overlap between both, and hopefully we will see that in the guidance as well.
So all those consultants are going to become extremely rich, aren't you, John?
Well, by parroting something that's produced by this.
Yeah, I look at these things and think that's just a money-making opportunity for the Big Four. They could be banned from such
This
contracts.
is why lobbying needs to be addressed as part of this framework as well, but that's a whole separate issue.
If they keep going, it might be only 3 in Australia.
It's been an absolute delight. And I hope to see you all very soon.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.